Virtue theory isn't very useful, according to some of its critics, if it doesn't tell you what to do. In contrast, one of its chief rivals, consequentialism, simply tells you to do that which produces the best consequences. And another rival, deontology, tells you to keep your promises, repay your debts, help those in need. It says, don't cheat in games, don't steal, don't rape, don't murder. It says to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Virtue theories tell you what type of person to be. Of course, you can't just decide to be a particular type of person. Persistent character traits, by definition, can't be picked up or dropped on the fly, and it still doesn't tell you what to do. It's just not very practical, according to its critics. Rosalind Hursthouse seeks to defend virtue theory from this type of criticism. She argues that virtue theory does tell you what to do. She says, quote, an action is right if and only if it is what a virtuous agent would characteristically, that is, acting in character, do in the circumstances, end quote. So if you want to know what to do in a given situation, you need only to determine what a virtuous person in that situation would do. A contemporary example of this method put into practice is built around the slogan, what would Jesus do? Assuming that Jesus is a moral exemplar and assuming that the agent's understanding of what Jesus would do is correct, then determining what Jesus would do would tell a person what they ought to do in those types of circumstances. But does it solve the problem? Of course, to answer the question of what a virtuous person would do, one would need to have an idea of what counts as a virtuous person, and then have an idea of what that person would do in the given circumstances. There are several conceptions of virtue to choose from. The Christian conception is only one. Hursthouse mentions others. There are virtue theories that give a list of virtues of being trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, etc., so on and so forth. Another option that Hursthouse mentions comes from a possible interpretation of David Hume's writings, where, quote, a virtue is a character trait of human beings that is useful or agreeable to its possessor or to others, end quote. There's the Aristotelian conception of virtue as a character trait a human being needs for eudaimonia, or to flourish or to live well. So yes, a virtue theory isn't very useful until it tells you what the virtues are. But Hursthouse argues that the two leading competitors to virtue theory, consequentialism and deontology, fare no better. Take consequentialism. If one wants to know what the right action is, consequentialism says, do that action that produces the best consequences. In other words, the consequentialist conception of right action is, an action is right if and only if it promotes the best consequences. But before we can use this principle to guide action, we have to know what counts as good consequences. Are we talking about good consequences for humans, or do consequences for animals count? Can there be good consequences for an ecosystem or a planet? In the realm of good consequences for humans, does only pleasure in the absence of pain count? Perhaps happiness or unhappiness. Perhaps goodness is found in desire satisfaction. Perhaps some other type of good is involved, knowledge, integrity, good relationships. Focusing on relationships, should we value our relationships only because of the happiness they bring us and the unhappiness prevented? Or should relationships be valued for their own sake, for qualities that are independent of their contribution to an agent's happiness? According to Hursthouse, consequentialism also has to deal with some serious questions before it can tell us which action is right. What about deontology? Deontology says that certain types of actions are intrinsically right or wrong. We don't judge an act by its consequences, but by the quality of the act itself. Is it lying? Is it cheating? Is it manipulative or abusive? Take, for example, keeping a promise. It's not okay to abandon a promise simply because one believes that it will produce good consequences, even if one's belief is true. You promised, and that means you have an obligation to act. In other words, for the deontologist, an action is right if and only if it is in accordance with a correct moral rule or principle. But now the deontologist has to tell us what counts as the correct moral rule or principle. Are they biblical commandments? Perhaps it's the Kantian categorical imperative. so act that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, never as a means. Is it the case that the correct principles are those that everybody would agree to, or the rules that they would agree to if they were to select those rules without knowing their race, gender, natural abilities or inabilities, and the like? Without knowing the correct principles, the action guiding command to act in accordance with the correct principles can be of little use. So Hursthouse concludes, the objection that virtue theories have trouble guiding action can't be used as a reason to reject it in favor of more action guiding theories such as consequentialism or deontology. They all have the same challenges when it comes to guiding action. Hursthouse then becomes concerned that this argument seems to be leading us to a type of moral skepticism. Under all three theories, consequentialism, deontology, and virtue theory, the argument says that it's sometimes difficult to determine the morally right action. To know the morally right action, we first need to know what counts as either the best consequences, or the correct moral rules, or the virtues. However, this exaggerates the problem. Yes, there are some questions about what counts as good consequences, but we know that traffic accidents and cancer are generally to be avoided. There may be some questions about the correct moral rules, but moral prohibitions on reckless behavior and breaking promises are widely understood. And similarly, there may be some characteristics such as patriotism whose status as a virtue is in question, but the virtues of being trustworthy, helpful, kind, prudent, temperate, and honest are widely accepted. Hursthouse's conclusion is that virtue theory can stand up with the other moral theories in terms of its ability to guide action. But there's another problem to consider. What does one do when the virtues conflict? What do you do when life makes you choose between, for example, keeping a promise to a friend and spending some time with a child when they've had a particularly upsetting day? As an aside, deontology has the same problem. What do you do when different principles conflict with each other? But consequentialists seem to have an easy answer. You choose the option that produces the best consequences. This is a serious challenge to both virtue and deontological theories, one which will be addressed in the next video.